Thanks for inviting me over here. I'm incredibly honoured to be here. I've been asked to talk about night markets, and I'll give you maybe 2/3 of the presentation on night markets, and I'll start out with a bit about who I am and what I've done in terms of nighttime economy work for the last almost 25 years now. I am at Make Associates, but I've not been at Make Associates for a long time. It's a company I founded in 2008, and before that, nobody was interested in the UK, at least, and pretty much nowhere around the world in the nighttime economy. And I think today that we're having this conference is an incredible testimony to how far we've come in such a short space of time. But as we heard this morning, still got a massively long way to go. And I remember when I first started out, I thought once I'd done the first nighttime economy strategy, anyway, can you see it? Oh, how about that? Can you see that? Yeah. So back in 1995, my first professor was the guy who created the concept of the nighttime economy. And I thought back then, once I did one off the back of a degree for Leeds City Council, you can see Leeds there, that once you'd done one, everyone would just copy it and you wouldn't need another one. And then remarkably, we're here almost 25 years later, still looking at the nighttime economy in a much more sophisticated and nuanced way. So we did this strategy, or I did the strategy back in 95, and it was incredibly primitive. And we looked at transport and lighting and so on and so forth. And we had this idea of what was a 24-hour city then. And this is laughable by today's standards because Leeds and its competitor Manchester, and they're often in fierce competition, both like to think they were 24-hour cities. But really the only 24-hour city back then was probably New York, maybe Singapore or Hong Kong. But it was the start. It was the start of some way of looking cohesively at how you manage towns and cities at night. And then nothing happened I could see for about 10 years because it was a nice academic idea but didn't really have any purchase in practical city and town development and management. And then the UK government asked me to look at, because basically I was the only person doing it in the UK at the time really, to look at what the city and town nighttime economies would look like in 10 years' time, so 2015. And I sort of thought about jetpacks and all the things that everyone sees. And it's funny, isn't it? It's never quite as radically different as today when we see the future. So I was quite modest in what we thought, and I spent a lot of time looking at consumer demographic research, speaking to thought leaders at the time. And we got some things right in that report. So in terms of the rise of food and the importance of that to culture in many countries, the city as spectacle and the experiential side of things. So for example, there's an ice skating rink there. I mean, obviously we're in Canada, so it's like kind of a little bit predictable here. But in London, there was no outdoor ice skating anywhere in the UK. And now there's 6 in London, massive, massive ice skating rinks. And it kind of taps into that whole experiential dimension of the city as spectacle. And in terms of other things, we sort of slightly foresaw in-home competition, so around things like Netflix and Amazon Prime, and urban living in the sense of the densification of cities and that drive to get more people living in cities. And what would that mean in terms of how we manage our towns and cities at night? Things we didn't really see was online retailing, and that's a massive issue for every economy around the world, some more so, some less than others, in terms of hollowing out those retail units and what we're going to put in those retail units for the next 10 or 20 years as Amazon sucks out every penny out of our pockets. An interesting development that's really in the last 5 years is the decline, particularly in Gen Z and millennials, of drinking as much alcohol, or some people are still drinking as much, or if not more, but a lot are drinking an awful lot less. And what impact does that have on our evening and nighttime economies, on the viability and the business models of today in terms of evening and nighttime economy? And contested spaces was another thing that we didn't really see, and that's some of the challenges and issues. And someone mentioned Sydney this morning, and we did a lot of work in Sydney. I'll touch on it shortly, about how the cities have become contested spaces at night in terms of residents versus bars versus performers. And we spent a lot of time doing mediation work around that and trying to build in planning the viability of future arts and culture and spaces. So then we came up with this model, which was a model of every aspect you could think about in terms of how you manage, even if you can't read it, but it was things like transport, culture, arts, everything down to lighting, security, safety. Inclusion and diversity is a really important thing. So when Laura mentioned this morning, I thought it was really important about how do we get more people, more families, more younger people in the evening and to a certain point the night. I was just talking to someone earlier about a piece of work we did in Liverpool where we looked at the number of 18 to 25-year-olds who seem to dominate our town and city centres, maybe 18 to 30-year-olds, and yet they only make up 4% of the population in the UK. So what are the other 96% of people doing? And then we were involved in Purple Flag, and I know Edmonton took on Purple Flag, and Purple Flag was a scheme for accrediting. We co-developed it with Paul Davis, the founder, a scheme for accrediting and managing town and city centres at night. And one of the strengths of that, there's now 75 schemes in the UK and Ireland, and they're starting to get onto university campuses. I'm only marginally involved with it now, but one of the advantages of that was when you don't have a town or city centre nighttime economy strategy, it was a vehicle for people coming together in partnership, and that was a big thing that came out of that session this morning was, how do we get the right stakeholders around the table? And whether you do it via that kind of methodology or another one, it's absolutely vital. And then in 2009, I got really sick of hearing about how much the nighttime economy was costing us in terms of alcohol-related harm, in terms of ambulance, in terms of hospital admissions and police costs. And while I think that's really important and we should measure it, I think it was also important to measure the economic value and benefit of that. So we measured the UK nighttime economy, this thing called Night Mix, and we're doing another study now for central London. And we looked at every part of the UK, every town and city, and measured its value. And we still use that in a lot of the pieces of work that we do today. And then quite often you might have seen the Nighttime Industry Association, which is a UK trade body now set up to promote and protect and enhance the nighttime economy. And there's an Australian one just started. And they always use our £66 billion to the UK economy of nighttime industries, although it's £71 billion, but no one seems to worry about that figure. As long as it's a big figure, that's what's really important, right? Anyway, so we did that, and then we got asked to do a piece of work in Sydney, and it's interesting what people were talking about Sydney earlier, and it is an incredibly good way of showing how you should never manage your evening and nighttime economy, and how delicate it is, surprisingly, because we think of it's quite robust, but it's incredibly fragile and shifting and fluid. And so we were asked by the mayor there, Clover Moore, to look at both the costs and the benefits of the evening and nighttime economy. And they created what at that point in 2010, 11, 12 was the most sophisticated response to any city management of the nighttime economy anywhere in the world. And then 2 very tragic deaths later, and the New South Wales government, I think it's important to point out, it was the New South Wales government, not the city government, then brought in the lockout laws on the back of that, and some research done by the public health body in New South Wales, and that crippled their evening and nighttime economy. And many of you will know about that, and they're now in the process of trying to rebuild that. There's been some slight benefits in terms of it got rid of some of the really worst venues, but really they should have been weeded out by the city authorities long before that. And so we're now in a sense that we put back, and I estimate maybe 15 years back on that global city, and that impacts on its jobs, on its credibility, its attractiveness to international students, its investment worthiness, etc., etc. And then you may have heard of Agent of Change. Who's heard of Agent of Change as a principle? So if you haven't heard of it, the idea behind Agent of Change, and Austin in Texas has probably been the forefront of that, but Melbourne also in Sydney. Agent of Change is very much about when we move into an area, it's absolutely right if we start developing residential flats and apartments, new businesses, that we protect, and it's our responsibility, not that of existing music venues, to protect their ability to carry on functioning, even if they're a little bit noisy. And the Ministry of Sound, which is one of the world's most famous nightclubs in London, was under threat from a 41-storey tower next to it. And you only need one person to complain in that tower that was going up, and it closed down that business. And the thing about Ministry of Sound is you wouldn't know it behind the scenes, but yes, it employs 50 people in that club on any typical night, and 150 staff overall. But that is a £150 million business. It's one of the world's largest, if not the world's largest independent record label now, Ministry of Sound, and employs 200 plus people in the building next to the club. And so they were very worried that that club was going to, which is their window on the world, was going to get closed down. So we helped them out with that, and they won their appeal against it, and they had triple glazing put in the building and covenants put in the building, so you couldn't complain about reasonable noise, and they still continue to function to this day. And now that's being embedded, by the way, in the London Plan and in the National Planning Framework in the UK, the agent of change, to protect venues across the country from residents moving in poorly designed buildings. So then we got into placemaking, this idea of nighttime placemaking. So we worked with a lot of landowners in London and in other locations about shaping how those places work during the day. So looking at who's there in the morning, the afternoon, the evening, and at night, working with demographic research, trying to understand how people's experience in the evening and nighttime economy in your town or city or part of it, how people flow through it, what they do, how long they dwell in there, how can we help make that attractive, what types of offer and brands and restaurants and the mix of it, so that we leave room for some kind of spontaneity, but we're also carefully shaping certain parts of it as well, so we don't end up with dead spots and tumbleweed towns. And then probably the most recent thing that we've done that might be of interesting is about safe spaces. It's a different concept perhaps to the one we were talking about before, which in the UK we have now 45 safe spaces, which are buses or physical spaces in busy nighttime economies around the country, where we've got medical staff, vulnerability trained people, and working with street pastors and street wardens to bring people in who've had too much to drink, who might be lost, and who might be vulnerable. And there are now 45 schemes in the UK, and Westminster, which runs the West End of London, is now starting what will probably be the most sophisticated one of those in the UK. And we're looking at how that can save the police, ambulance, hospitals costs in terms of preventing people having to go to hospital having had too much to drink and fallen over, preventing people becoming victims of crime and predation. So I can tell you more about that later if you like. And we're working with Sound Diplomacy on probably the latest piece of work. I think this is the first time I've ever seen it done anywhere in the UK, and certainly maybe around the world, which is a supplementary planning document, and it is as boring as it sounds. But it's a piece of work which, rather than just your planning document embodying where we should have our nighttime economy, the proportions of type of venues and bars, etc., this is the first time I think we've got a separate document which is legally enshrined, which will come out next year when we finished it, which will say protect all those existing venues in and around Olympic Park in East London, and will enshrine their value. We will then assign areas where we will expect people to be able to apply for new licenses and for new live performances, and also it will embody and encode protections for those venues, as I've talked about before. So we're trying to create an ecosystem of Sound Diplomacy we'll talk about, where we protect and enhance and grow and provide the opportunities for working with developers and developer contributions to art and cultural spaces in that nighttime economy. So as you may know, London's lost 50% of its nighttime venues over the last 20 years, and we're trying to reverse that by embedding that in a new planning document. So finally, I'll talk you through a bit about night markets, because that's why I'm here. So having done a lot of theoretical stuff over the years, a friend of mine was on tour with a theatre company in the Far East, and she went to Shilin Night Market in Taipei. Has anyone been to any Far Eastern night markets? Right, so we've got quite a few. Very cool, very interesting, completely different culturally to Europe and North America. And she came back, she said, well, why don't we have this sort of thing in the UK? And I said, well, I don't know. We sort of have Christmas markets, which are sort of influenced by German, and they're really lovely and they're really good family events, but they are, as the name suggests, Christmas. And they don't really take place around the rest of the year. And so a lot of our town and city centres are really dead during the weekdays in particular. And so we said, well, how can we find a way of animating this that brings the best of the world's night markets to the UK? And we sort of went off and did some research, and we found Victoria Market, which is an incredible daytime market, but becomes during summer, and they have a Christmas one as well. But every week, every Friday and Saturday, amazing night market with a whole set of new traders who come into the market and liven it up. Tens of thousands of people going through live music and so on and so forth. And then we looked for another one. We wanted something that was more about a one-off event or colonised a public space. And I don't know, has anyone been to Night It Up in Markham, near Toronto? Ooh. Oh, one person, the Welsh person. has been there. Oh. All right, so Night It Up has been going for quite a long time. It's really community focused, came out of Chinese community there. But now obviously it's a very inclusive, much broader event. Hundreds of stores, 150,000 people over 3 nights in July. It's a mega event, and we learnt a lot from that, but it was really quite a bit bigger than what we were looking to try and replicate in London. So we started this concept called the stock market. In 2010, and we had no idea what we were doing apart from having some conversations with Night It Up. So we knew we needed some street food, but there wasn't really any street food in London at that point in time. Now you can't move for it, so we went around trying to find some of the prototypes for street food traders. So we got some of those on. They had to be local. And then we sort of went, well, farmers markets, everyone likes farmers markets. Well, some people do. So let's go and find some farmers markets traders. And we insisted that they all come from local areas. So one of the first places we did it had a beekeeper on the roof nearby. So we got him down and he started selling bees and honey and doing bee demonstrations. And it was like, oh, it's quite successful. And now he's won loads of awards. And that was his first time ever selling. And then we got designer makers in, so everything had to be ecological because that's what really matters, right? So sustainable cotton and organic ingredients and chemical-free soaps and so on and so forth. So that was another part of it. And I think in terms of our numbers, we always try to have more than half artisan products, or at least decent products, but I always used to insist they try and sell them at a sensible price because the places that we did our markets were not in glamorous locations. So the idea was we managed to find lots and lots of small public spaces that needed animating, and that's what I was much more interested in than necessarily doing stuff in Covent Garden in the centre of London. And critical to everything that we did was the music and arts element. So we kind of scurried around for really interesting proposals. So there we got electric pedals in the top left-hand corner, and they powered our cinema and all our sound systems on bikes. And unless we couldn't get enough people to bike, then we had to go back to the diesel generator. But that's another question. But most of the time we could power an entire cinema where we had local arts students creating films and stuff. And one of the biggest things that we found at success in terms of, and goes back to notions of community and involving lots of people who aren't traditionally involved in the evening and nighttime economy, was getting students from local universities. So part of their courses was to work with us to create installations in the night market as part of their coursework, and they were marked, and obviously that made it really interesting for all the tutors who could come out and do their marking while having a beer rather than sat in an office. And we always had live music on there. And then Sharon, who I started it with, she said, community is absolutely the most important part of this. So at every single night market, and we did over 50 of them, we had a community project and we got that sponsored. And this one is an example. We used some guerrilla light artists, who are friends of mine who do light malls in Q8 and stuff. But in the daytime, they thought, well, let's do something much more interesting and less commercial. So we got them working with a local school to throw up 50-foot high versions of kids' paintings about their sense of community. And so they spent workshops working with them. And we got loads and loads of parents to come down at the same time, and it brought a whole new demographic into our area by working with local schools. And that was one of the greatest things for me about running a night market for so long, was about that community engagement. So I've got some statistics, I won't read them all out, but in terms of the size of them, we could have between 1,000 and 5,000 overnight. We brought in a lot of people who never came into towns and city centres in the evening, so families and older people. And that was really important to me, that it wasn't just hipsters in plaid shirts with beards, because there's plenty of those in East London. But this was about families and diversity. It's about financial inclusion as well, which is a really important part. So for me, you could come along to our market, you didn't have to pay anything to come in, you could look at all the live music and art for free. That was a stipulation, whereas some night markets you have to pay to go into, and I would refuse to have that. And in terms of the cost of putting them on, they cost from about 2,000 to 5,000 UK pounds, and we didn't make loads of money on it. As a gross profit margin, it wasn't a massive earner, and that's why in the end we decided that we would knock it on the head, because it was just so much work whereas if you're a community, you could make it work as a series through volunteers. But for us, financially, it was just impossible. And my girlfriend kept complaining that I wasn't doing any real work, in inverted commas, and therefore I spent more time on that than chasing the invoices from my consultancy. So I was told that in no uncertain terms, unless it started making loads of money, we had to give it up. And we started it as a community interest company anyway. So sadly, it came to an end. And in some ways, that was sad. But it inspired a whole load of other people to start taking up the idea and running with it. So if you've been to London recently, Dinerama here is probably one of the biggest street food operations in London, or certainly in the world. They've got 5 big sites now, with each of those venues turning out maybe 100 new street food traders every year, giving them opportunities to trade, corporate events, so on and so forth. They have live music every night. It's almost like someone else tried that for them and they commercialized it. You have to pay to get in. They have door supervisors, which are things I don't like, but that's conditions of their licenses. Curb is another collective who run street food across the whole of London, but have nighttime events. And I'm currently advising them on a central London site where they will set up a new, more open approach to the evening and nighttime running of a night market right in the centre. And then you might know of Time Outs. They've got one in Boston. This was the first one in Lisbon, and they've got plans for 50 night markets, but they're very formal, the ones that Time Out are doing. They're very much about food, gastro, side of things rather than the community. But again, things that have come out of that movement of night markets is very diverse. And I suppose that's one of the things I wanted to share, is that I think lots of towns and cities can do night markets, but there's no one model that works for any particular place. I actually think you can take it and completely customize it to your particular location, no matter how big or small. And in fact, some of the people that worked on our market went off around the UK and started night markets in a whole range of locations. So the top left one is Pedlar Market in Sheffield, and Ben, our bar manager, went up there and he's doing an amazing job of running a night market every month up in Sheffield. It's got an incredible music city, as you'll know, and they've got loads of new fresh artists in there every month. And you know, we had people down from the Arctic Monkeys doing acoustic sets. He's done brilliantly up there. And so we've got some success stories, and this is the one thing that I think is so magical about night markets that you can generate, is loads of opportunities for artists, creatives, businesses to take that first step on a very low risk environment. And so Pizza Pilgrims are now probably the hottest pizza people in London, and they started out on our stall and they sold out in 2 hours. And they didn't make enough dough, and they learnt their lesson. They came back, and now they're, you know, regarded rightly as probably the finest pizza in London. This is B. B's interesting character. I don't know what she's holding here, but it's a deep fried thing with ice cream in the middle and caramel. It's incredibly delicious, and she's now got 4 very, very nice tea shops in London. Alexander Cameling started out with his crazy spirit, and now he's won awards, and all his products are stocked in Selfridges and Fortnum & Masons, and you can buy them online. He's now launched a gin as part of the gin craze. He's doing really well. The Park Brewery down in Kingston, near Richmond, the Deer Park there, they sold their very first bottles of beer on the market, and they then got the keys to their brewery about 5 years later. And we remember stories of going back to when we would have to help them with labelling their bottles for the market because they didn't really know how to label anything. And now they're super successful, won some awards, and they're even giving Kickstarter or crowdfunder conversations about how to raise money, because they've done an amazing crowdfunder to buy that building and brewing space. This is Jane, who's now ended up on national TV. She was a wine writer in the early stages of her career, and we did Sherry O'Clock with her, which she loves sherry, don't we all? So we got her doing Sherry O'Clock and introducing people to that. And now she's ended up with Jamie Oliver on Saturday morning TV in the UK. But probably my 2 favourites. This is Louis. And Louis runs a thing called Culture Cuts, which is, you know, one of the coolest DJ outfits in London. If you need to know anything about reggaeton or favela jazz from the 1960s from Brazil, Louis is your man. And he started out, and we paid him London living wage, as we did for everybody. and he's now ended up as musical director of Pop Brixton, which is another kind of night market type event that we've worked with as well, and he's just found his way to there. I'm really proud of him. And then Michael Parkin, Michael is one of the best illustrators around, and he won the Guardian Award last year or 2 years ago for Best Illustrator, and he created all our graphics early on, and as you can see in the top left there. And since then he's gone on to work for the New York Times and for the Guardian, the London Times, LA Times, and loads of fantastic magazines, and Vogue and Condé Nast, doing illustrations for them. I particularly like the Donald Trump one, of course. And he's carved out his own voice, but he'd never even written an invoice before he got involved in our market. So I showed him how to invoice me. I suggested he made it a little bit less than he was planning to. But for me, this is the most important value that a night market can have, particularly a community-focused one, is about giving people those opportunities to start businesses, to take risks, and to be an environment that allows them to be creative, and you can support them as people who are running a night market, and the value is massive, both to the community, individual businesses, as well as the great satisfaction we got out of it. So yes, I miss doing it, and if I could do it again, I would, but I'd get someone else to do all the hard work for me. Thanks very much.